Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Leadership Project with your host Mick Spears. We bring you thought-provoking guests and topics every week to challenge your thinking about leadership. Our aim is to help you become the leader that you wish you always had as we learn together and lead together. Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Leadership Project. I'm greatly honoured today to be joined by Brad Giles. Brad is the owner of Evolution Partners. He's also the best-selling author of 2 books, Made to Thrive and Onboarded. And today's discussion is going to predominantly be around that second topic, around this whole complex process of onboarding and when it goes well and when it goes wrong. And I think most of you in the audience have probably had an example in your lifetime where it was either yourself or someone else around you where the onboarding process didn't go as well as it should have. So I'm really excited about today's discussion. Brad, please do say hello to our audience and give us a little bit of a flavour of your rich background and what led you to be interested in this space around onboarding.
Thanks, Mick. It's great to be here. I guess I've always been interested in business. I was perhaps what you might call a serial entrepreneur, started many businesses. Some of them went pretty well. Some of them went not so well. And that's often the journey. Today, I work with people helping entrepreneur-led businesses in their challenges through life. And that's really the segue to the second part of your question there, which is the first book I wrote because I felt that most leaders I come across, they didn't really know what their job was. They know what an electrician does, they know what a nurse does, what a doctor does, and what a carpenter does, but there was no real prescriptive guide on how to be a great CEO. And that then led to this book, because if that was the first kind of big hole that I viewed through my lens in my world, I guess I saw the next big one as being onboarding. And that is really getting people to understand how to succeed in their role. And so how it kind of came about is I started off asking people this question to evaluate the people that they were having challenges with. So I'd be coaching and working with someone. And so I would say, so tell me about person X. How capable are they of succeeding in the role as you define success? How well do they understand how to succeed in the role as you define? And then how much do they want to succeed in the role as you define? And I'd give them a kind of a 1 to 10 score. But the understand was the thing, right? They were capable and they wanted to succeed, but they didn't understand. And that understand came back to, that's the job of that leader. It's no one else's job to help them to understand how to succeed. And so that was one of the tools in the first book that then it really just struck me that this is the next biggest thing. People don't really understand how to succeed in their role much of the time. And then the more I dug into it, the more I began to realize, well, almost everyone has a bad onboarding story, and almost every company does a bad job of it.
So you've got a rich environment to work there with without any doubt, Brad. I want to go back to the first book first and we'll work our way towards Onboarded. So in Made to Thrive, you do talk about the differences between a good leader and a great leader. Give us the Brad Giles view of that.
Yeah, thank you. Now, listeners may think, look, the working title, I'll just preface this by saying the working title was the 5 roles of a CEO. And it's adapted to suit leadership as well because it had a broader appeal than just that. But to your point, you might look at a leader and say, look, well, a great leader, a great CEO creates a higher net percentage. Okay. Or they create a greater return on shareholder equity. Okay. But what if they're burning the balance sheet? Or what if their attrition rate is just terrible? And so it really became quite apparent that, again, across all the leaders that I was working with, some of them, let's say, were more engineering types that were less about the people, and some of them were more people types that were less about the science, and others were more finance types. And that's not a broad brush. It's just, it became more and more obvious that there are different roles that need to be undertaken. And those 5 roles that I prescribe in the book through the 5 chapters are accountability, ambassador, culture, strategy, and succession planning. So they're the 5 things. And I make the case throughout the book as to why that is, and it's very prescriptive. And so it was the accountability component in particular that led to the onboarding book through Capable, Understand, Want that I mentioned before.
Okay, so let's unpack that a little bit more. Where do you think we go wrong around this space of accountability?
In relation to the CEO's role, just to be sure?
I'm going to say across the board, but let's say it starts with the CEO. But there seems to be a lot of discussion out there about, people saying that people don't want to take accountability for their actions. They don't want responsibility. What's your view?
Well, my view is that leaders grow leaders. Like a great leader has to grow leaders. Now, I guess some people are happy having a good business or a good environment, and that's totally fine if that's your cup of tea, but it's not necessarily mine. And I suspect it's not either yours, Mick. And so if you want to build a great business or if you want to have a high performing team, well, you've got to have a high accountability as a part of that, right? And if not only for the reason that high performers will look at you if you don't act on people who aren't being held accountable, and they will think that you just don't care. So yeah, it's so important to have, and accountability is really kind of first. Everyone's got to know, when are they having a good day or week? When are they doing the right thing? When are they not? And ultimately they know how they can get fired through the numbers or through behavioral misadventure, let's just say. So yeah, accountability is, if you want to build a great business, accountability is centered to it. Why don't people do it? I think that they want to be people's friends much of the time. I think that they see them, they don't understand the role is probably the best way to put it. I think that they might look at their previous role and say, oh, look, my last boss was a turkey. I don't want to be like that. I want to, set my own course and do things the way that I believe, not really appreciating that many of these things are in there for a reason.
The word balance is coming to my mind, Brad, in terms of all of that. And I was hearing you talk before about, someone might be very people-oriented, another one might be very performance-oriented. So you think of, Hofstadter's dilemmas when you think of things like that. The other one that's popping into my mind, I'd love your view on, is the 3 dimensions of leadership, that you need to be able to lead self, you need to be able to lead others, and you need to be able to lead the business and be able to balance those 3 dimensions. And quite often we end up with, and I'll use your terms here, good and great here for a moment, you end up with a good leader who might have 1 or 2 of those dimensions nailed, but to be a great leader, you need to have all 3, leading self, leading others, leading the business. What are your thoughts on that?
Absolutely. There's a saying, and I don't remember the female thought leader, and she says that the problem with A players is that they'll eventually, peck each other to death. And so in relation to what you're asking here, I think that managing yourself is absolutely critical. I have a friend in Canada and he wrote a book called Your Oxygen Mask First. And it's like, you absolutely must look after yourself. That's absolutely critical. I think that leading only the numbers is fine, but that's exactly what I'm saying. Like, it's only one aspect of it. When you get to the corner office, what you realize is the corner office is actually, the job is to grow everybody else around you, as I mentioned before. If you think that there's going to be some kind of release or some kind of ease when you get there, but the job is actually real, and it's about leading other people and growing other people primarily. So yeah, and to get those people to create the results. So growing other people, growing the business, which happens by way of the other people, the efficacy that you put into the other people, and then managing, or leading yourself through that. Totally agree.
So I feel like what I'm hearing there, Brad, but please correct me if I'm getting the wrong interpretation, that any unique focus on one of those things is going to end up with a short-term result. So if you focus on numbers only, you might have a great quarter, you might have a great year, but you're not building the future success of the business, which will be on the back of people.
Oh, look, absolutely. Within Made Thrive, I mentioned those 5 roles, okay? Accountability ambassador, culture, strategy, succession planning. On the front of the book, there's a 5-pointed star. And the point of it is that the output is what we really want. And the initial output that I mentioned is a great leader, CEO, may be perceived as creating a higher net profit, okay? A higher EBITDA, higher shareholder, whatever it is. But it's the intersection of those 2 roles. It is working on both ambassador and accountability, for example, that creates a higher percentage of net performers. It is the work on both the ambassador and the culture that creates higher retention and so forth. So it is the outputs that matter. Like, it's a results-driven book because I've got a results-driven personality. Like, that's why we do it. But it is the inputs that you got to understand. And if you're absent or not working on one of those inputs, that's a problem. And one of the things that many people mentioned was either A, ambassador, or B, succession planning, that they weren't really necessarily working on.
So let's unpack that a little bit more. When you say ambassador, what do you believe it takes to be a good ambassador?
Well, I'll preface it by saying that trust, okay? So to build trust is the reason that we're doing it across multiple stakeholders, across employees, across customers, across shareholders if appropriate. And you can't be the head of the company unless you're the face of the company as well, because people don't trust a faceless company. And so you need to do it in your own flavor. Some people, have an introverted or an extroverted personality. Some people like doing some things, but understanding that there's a role to be done, and that role impacts the people side of the business, the ability to have a higher percentage of A players and the ability to positively impact retention, it really matters.
So what I'm hearing there, Brad, is that you can still show up as your authentic self. So we're not asking you to translate your personality, but don't ignore the fact that you are an ambassador of the brand of the company. And if you want to attract the right talent to the company, you need to be out there and be the face of the company, and to be out there exposing the values of the organization to attract people that believe in the things that you believe. Is that what I'm hearing there?
Absolutely. You can think about business owners on television who are selling, furniture or white goods or whatever it is, and they're the face of their adverts. That's absolutely not what I'm talking about, right? It is being your authentic self, but being a face that people can build trust because of your authentic self. I would say almost all of the leaders that I come across are quite authentic in nature, and they want to do the right thing, and that, they want to build a good or great business. They want to do things. And so there is certainly material to work with there.
You mentioned about succession planning. I'd like to unpack that a little bit for a while as well. It's in many companies, and I'm sure you've seen this as well, Brad, that succession planning is a once-a-year activity. It's a tick in the box. What do you think makes a good succession planning approach?
Well, I suppose succession planning, most people, when they hear it, would think about a family business and leaving it to future generations, perhaps. But that's absolutely not what I'm talking about. If we look at the outputs, I mentioned the outputs between the points of the star, right? The output of succession planning is consistent strategy and consistent execution, okay? It's the consistency that comes about by way of succession planning. So, for example, once a month, an analysis of your gross profit trends by customer. For example, a regular analysis of suppliers and supplier intel as to what could go right or wrong at the moment. So there's a range of things that you can do, but it's about consistency, because when you have inconsistent revenues or inconsistent profits, you can't really build a great business, because all you're doing is chasing your tail. In the good times, catch up for the bad times. Now, those good and bad times, and I live in Western Australia, right? We're a mining economy. Things go up and things go down. It permeates the whole economy. But still, the job to be done is to understand it is the consistency that matters. And that consistency, if you want a great business, is about dotting the I's and crossing the T's around the risks.
All right, I want to move now to Onboarded. Why Onboarded, and why write that book now?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, it felt like I was interested to do a research project. That was one part of it. And it felt like this was the gap, because I felt like in my world, through my eyes, there was a gap with the first book, Made to Thrive. And here it felt like there was a gap. And the more that I dug into it, I just couldn't find simple, prescriptive book that was aimed at people who wanted to onboard well, to help people understand that wasn't simply trying to sell me software or their services. That was more a case of this is what you must do. So I'm sure that there are some books out there and some of them are quite good, but I wanted to kind of fill that gap and really, in the language for the mid-market that we use, make it really quite simple and effective, that any manager could really pick it up. It'd take an hour and a half to read or so, and they could understand it. And it made a compelling case as to this is why you need to do the thing that you're not doing, because nobody's doing it, or very few people are doing it. And that because the more that I dug in, the weight of the data was simply overwhelming. It's a great opportunity to help people to understand, to positively impact new hires and the financial and cultural benefits.
I do feel that you're right, by the way. There's some decent references out there for people starting a new job, like The First 90 Days by Michael Watkins or things like that. But from the other side, there's not a lot out there. And yet every company does it, and so many companies are doing it poorly. So I do believe that you are addressing an issue there in the market. This is going to sound really basic, but I would love to hear your own definition of what onboarding actually is.
Onboarding is the process of taking someone outside of the organisation and making them a successful fit, causing them to be a successful fit where they understand the technical processes, the cultural expectations and their own direct manager's expectations, or they are exited because they are an unsuccessful fit.
You're using some really interesting language there, and it makes me think of something I've heard you talk about, Brad, and I'd like to unpack that now. So you're saying creating the environment, it wasn't the exact words used, but creating the environment where they can be a successful fit versus an unsuccessful fit. And I've heard you talk about maybe that the terms good hire and bad hire are not necessarily helping us. Tell us about that.
Yeah. So the job of onboarding, the job of the manager is to cause the person to fit, okay, and to validate that this person is either a good fit or they are a bad fit. And we can validate that because of the work that we've done in the first 90 days. Now, I'll just put an asterisk on that. If it's 90 days, some people do 6 months, some people do 4 months, that's fine. But I picked 90 days specifically because in the research, I found that in most countries around the world, at about the 90-day point, that's when the legal probation period ends and you're not able to exit them without further ramifications. Okay, so that was that. But the other point is that 90 days, 3 months, I guess it took that much time to get the person to actually understand. So circling back to your question, good fit, bad fit. So let's think about a person who recently left an organization hypothetically, and we might look back at that person and say, oh, that person was a good fit. Okay, how do you know? Well, they're still here. And then you might look at another person and might say, yeah, that person was a bad fit. How do you know? How do you validate? How are you sure of that? And then you would say, well, they're not here. Quite clearly, they're not here. That's why they were a bad fit. But there's very little thought apart from that goes into it. Like, how do we know? And so this is what I call the binary fit fallacy. Okay, so let me just unpack that for a sec. So when we look at previous hires and we say that it's a binary, it's black or white, good or bad, what we're doing is we're indoctrinating our teams into the tyranny of low expectations. And so what we're really saying to our managers, look, it doesn't matter if you onboard or not, because if they're a good fit, they'll work out. And if they're a bad fit, they won't. And so if they're a good fit on day one, they'll figure it out. It'll be fine. And so what that means is that if you're the new hire, you don't have a chance. But the reality is that it's actually a spectrum from they definitely won't work in the organization through a spectrum of grey to they definitely will work. Okay. So every candidate, I put it to you, lands somewhere along there and they don't understand the culture of your business. They've never worked in there before. They don't understand the technical and process expectations because they've never worked there and they shouldn't. You might have different software or different ways that you do things and they don't understand your managers or the manager's expectations. And so if we look at people on a spectrum, we think, look, they've landed somewhere and in 90 days, we've got to validate that they are a successful fit or they're an unsuccessful fit and exit them. And that's the job to be done. And it can't be done by HR. It can't be done by anyone else except for HR can play a role, but it's got to be done by their direct manager.
So what I'm hearing here is the terms that we use, and I like this binary term that you're using, but the terms that we use end up masking whether there are issues with the onboarding process. So if someone exits stage left after, it might even be shorter, it might even be the first month, and they just go, I'm out of here. Instead of having a good hard look at your own processes and your own culture and your own onboarding approach, it's very easy to just blame the other person and say, it's okay, they were not a good fit, so we let them go. Even though they were the ones that left, we let them go, but they left because everything was so unclear to them or whatever the case may be, right? Is that what I'm hearing?
Absolutely. And then it's this vicious circle whereby then it's like, look, we made a mistake in that one. We should have probably hired better. It wasn't really our fault. It was really their fault. But, let's try and get some better candidates next time. And there's no thought at all about causing the new hire to understand how to succeed in the role because it completely removes the responsibility of managers. And therefore it's like, well, there's no point onboarding. And then people mix up onboarding and induction and they go, yeah, we onboarded them. We showed them where the bathrooms were and, we taught them how to use the email. What are you talking about? And so there's this great misunderstanding.
So what I'm hearing there is the reflection, if anything, becomes on the selection process, not the onboarding process.
Yeah, that's right. And so because people look at it as being a good fit or a bad fit, they think, oh, well, that person wouldn't have fit, as I said at the beginning. Like they were a bad fit. They were only here for 2 weeks and they quit. They were quite clearly a bad fit. But it's like, well, they seemed like they were really good at the interview. So what happened between the interview and 2 weeks later? Oh, that's right. They spent 2 weeks with you, their manager, and you didn't help them to understand how to succeed in the role. They were perfectly qualified and they were on that spectrum, but you didn't help to grow them.
So what does good onboarding look like then, Brad?
Well, quite simply, they understand and they cause them to fit, right? That's the real simple definition, that a manager can validate, yes, this person is a successful fit. That's the really, really simple version. A good onboarding, it takes what should take otherwise previously maybe 9 months to get them to be, let's say, fully productive. Now, it depends on the role, right? If you're a cashier in a Coles or a Woolworths or a supermarket, it's not going to be necessarily 9 months, right? We've got to adapt it to the role that that is suitable. But what what would otherwise take 9 months, and it compresses that understanding down to 90 days, and it removes the ongoing misunderstanding that I call onboarding debt for that new hire, which has second order consequences of misunderstanding in rework and mistakes and problems.
So that is one I wanted to ask you about. So let's get into that now. What does onboarding debt mean?
Well, it's an analogy to sleep debt because we all understand sleep debt, and we know that if we don't get enough sleep for a night or two, it's probably no consequence. You'll be a bit grumpy perhaps, but you can catch up on it. It's okay. But if you don't get enough sleep for months or even years, there's serious health consequences. And so that's the analogy for onboarding debt. So I use that word understanding. So if people don't understand how to succeed in the role across those three areas, managers' expectations, cultural expectations, technical and process expectations, if they don't understand, and it doesn't need to be 100%, but the less that they understand across those three areas, that delta, that gap between what they do understand and what they don't understand relative to what they should understand, that's the onboarding debt. So you think about one person, and imagine after 90 days, they were assessed by their manager across a scale of 1 to 10. So managers' expectations will give them a 6 out of 10, and technical process will give them a 6, and then cultural will give them a 7. Okay, so an average of something like 6.6. Well, what happens to that misunderstanding? And then think about all of the other people who've joined. If they've also got a 6 or a 6 average, you've got then 10, 20, 100 people who all have this manifested debt or deficiency of understanding. And the way that they understand, the way that they interact, they're all trying to do the right thing, okay, but they're doing what they think is right, but what might not necessarily be right. And so we know that aligned teams perform significantly better. And so when all of these people are doing what they think is right, but might not necessarily be the right thing, that's where it leads to onboarding debt. And that onboarding debt costs money.
Okay, so what I'm hearing in my own terms, I guess, would be an expectation mismatch. And that expectation mismatch might be just, let's say, a few degrees out, might be 10 degrees out. So the person is running down the road 10% off course, but in 6 months' time, they're 3 miles off course because you didn't address it early.
Yeah. And so imagine that a person had been in a role for 2 years and you ask that person's manager, so what's wrong today? Oh, this person, they got this wrong. Okay. And so then we go back and we say, so how capable are they of succeeding in the role? Well, they're like a 9. They've done this role before. How much do they want to succeed in the role? We'll give them like a 9. Okay. How well do they understand? And that's where it comes back. And it's like, so why don't they understand? What did you do in the onboarding? Oh, we just had them on for a week and they shadowed me or they did this but it wasn't, we didn't make them understand. And so even years later, that manifests into all of these things. But the problem is that you get this opportunity when they're new and they're eager and they want to learn. But 2 years later, you just seem like a turkey if you're the boss trying to re-onboard them or to get them to understand things. It's like, why are we doing this change management stuff? Like, this is not how we do it, because how they were doing it is the way that they think was right and have established a habit around.
Yeah, and habits are very hard to break once they're well ingrained. And if you're 2 years down the track, it's going to be, you're now talking about change. You're not talking about alignment. You're talking about change. It is interesting. The one dilemma I've got in my brain right now, Brad, is yes, clarity of expectations. I'm going to throw 3 terms out there and let's just juggle them for a bit. Clarity of expectations makes complete sense to me. But what we don't want is micromanagement. And what we do want is to embrace diversity of thought. So if someone comes into the organization and they might be good at what they do, they might be coming from a competitor, they might be coming from a different industry with different experiences and backgrounds. How do you balance expectations versus embracing them for who they are and actually listening to them? Because they might have a different way of doing XYZ that is actually better than the way that we've been doing it, right? So different is not necessarily wrong. Wrong is wrong, but different is not necessarily wrong. So how do you balance expectations versus embracing?
Great question. I think there's 2 parts to the answer. And the first part is our job is to grow leaders. Our job is to help them to be successful and to make them into a better version of themselves. And they may have better ideas around things. They may do things better. That's for sure. But that should come through in the onboarding process. Absolutely, I'd be advocating a humble approach. Absolutely. But the onboarding process over 90 days, 3 months, I've broken up in the book into these 3 stages of understand month 1, learn and apply month 2, and then embed month 3. So understand in the first 30 days is very much about teaching, and then switching in month 2, learn and apply, is a little bit more like mentoring, and then switching at the end to a coaching relationship based around the results. And so coaching is about asking questions predominantly. So we absolutely don't want micromanagement. One of the absolute keys is managing the results, not the activities. But an example might be core values and core values behaviors, right? So core values, many people have got their own kind of take on it, okay? But the way that I describe it in the book is core values kind of like the headline broader statements, whereas the behaviors, which is a subset of the core values, are very prescriptive. We always do this and we never do that. And so we want to have core values stories and core values behaviors stories about what to do and what not to do woven into that onboarding process across that 90 days. And so it's not really micromanagement, but then applying over that lens, those 3 months, perhaps in the first 30 days, we're saying, well, here's a core value story from before, something great that someone done that filters into the core values. And then by month 2, we're asking them, okay, so are there anything great that you've seen anyone done, and does it connect with any of the values? And then by month 3, you're very much switching over to really coaching. And then rather than mentoring, you're really switching over to coaching and then asking them more led questions around the values and behaviors as to what they've observed and what they haven't, and, you know, where do they see it go wrong, etc.
So what I'm hearing there is 2 things, Brad. I'm hearing that in that 90 days, it can be a 2-way expectation setting. It's not just a one-way, you will do it this way, et cetera, and the focus on results rather than approach. And then the second one is embedding the behaviors and culture that you want in the organization. And if there is a cultural mismatch, to be able to identify that early and say, well, you know, we don't have those behaviors here. These are our values, and our values are important to us. So there's an expectation alignment, and then there's a behavioral expectation alignment.
Oh, absolutely. And that's the job to help them to understand. If we zoom out, that's the job to help them to understand through that 90-day process. That's exactly what we've got to do, just applied through that cultural lens.
Yeah, really good, Brad. You speak about 2 main tools to use in the process. You talk about a role scorecard. Tell me about the role scorecard.
Yeah. So the first thing is to understand, what does success look like? It's all good and well to talk about this stuff, but, you know, we need to get rubber on the road, or we need to get things happening. So the first thing is for the manager, not HR, to understand, what does success look like in the role across those 3 lenses. So manager, technical and cultural expectations and understanding. If we get anybody into this role with that qualification, what will success look like in 90 days? Okay. And so that is documented through the role scorecard. That is quite specific, and it's not like a job description. A job description is quite fluffy, whereas this is intended to really quite clearly define what success is. There is an example in the book of what I mean by that, but it's got, for example, if you were sales, you need to sell $100,000 by 90 days. You need to have an understanding of the challenges that the sales team endure, whatever it might be. So it's really quite specific, so that you point to that document, and look, it's really a 1-pager, maybe 1.5 pager, depending, that you can really outline what is the purpose of the role, what is the accountabilities, what are the key metrics that have to achieve that success, and what are the other competencies around managers' expectations, cultural expectations, technical process.
So I'm hearing a lot of clarity of expectation there, and avoiding any ambiguity around that, which when you get to the 90-day point, I guess it makes whatever that next conversation is, whether it's a positive one or a negative one, it's on the basis of something that was set with a lot of clarity from the outset. Yeah, really good.
Yeah, you've got to know what success looks like. That's the first tool, the role scorecard. You absolutely must be able to say, at that point in time, if this is being achieved, we have a successful fit.
Yeah, really good. Okay, what was the second tool?
Well, if the role scorecard is what success looks like, then the second tool is the onboarding sprint plan. And that is how we will cause the new hire to understand or succeed or be a successful fit. And so effectively what we're doing is dividing up into 13 weeks plus a start day. And we're really saying, what do we need to discuss or get the person to do each week across 13 weeks so that we're confident that we've got a successful fit at the 13-week point. And so, for example, I gave before, well, each week across the 13 weeks, for example, we're going to have to discuss core values stories and or core values stories behaviors. Core values behaviors stories. Or we're going to have to pick a random thing. We're going to have to get them to visit 4 customer sites in month 2 or week 4 or whatever it might be. And so all of these quite little things that really comes back to the manager asking themselves, this person, based on that role scorecard, this person won't be successful by month 4 unless they've done that or they've done that. And so starting by really segmenting it into those 3 sections of understand month 1, learn and apply month 2, and then embed month 3, well, we can't go from month 1 to month 2 unless they've completed all those things. So, for example, unless they've visited 4 customer sites by the first month, I can't really let them into month 2. So thinking about it like that, because if we get to the end of the onboarding and they haven't visited any customer sites, and that's an important part of the role, it's got to be a red flag or it's got to be a job to be done before we can sign them off as a successful fit.
So what I'm hearing with this onboarding sprint plan, the word is coming to my mind is intentionality. So you're really setting a clear intent to enable them for success from the outset. And then if they don't get across the line, you've got some clear decision points where you'll go, well, we set this plan, we backed you, we gave you everything you needed and it didn't work, right?
Well, that's the word I used before. Like we caused them to succeed. You know, you get to the 90-day point, you can confidently say we caused them to succeed. And to the question on successful and unsuccessful fit, there's a company I work with and they rolled this out through their whole business and people started getting a bit anxious about like in 90 days, I'm an unsuccessful fit. What does that mean? Like, are they going to fire me? And the CEO had such a great response. He said, we're not spending all of this time and money and effort to make you leave. Like we believe that you have the capability and that you want to be successful here. And that's why we're doing these things so that we can help you to be successful. So it can, at first glance, people can look at it and think, oh, what does an unsuccessful fit mean? I've already got the job. This doesn't make sense, but we want them to be successful. That's why we're doing the things. We want them to understand how to succeed.
Instead of what I would say is happening in many companies, which is leaving it to chance. You have an induction, different onboarding. You have an induction on day 1 and then the manager has a check-in on day 90 and it becomes binary again. Back to that word binary. Yeah.
And to that point, so I did this research study and there was only 4% of companies that were doing a 90-day onboarding. Now, this was 1,100 CEOs and hiring managers across the globe on a fairly even split through, let's say, 10 employees to greater than 500 employees. And there was, as I said, about 4% were doing a 90-day, 49% were 7 days or less, 83% were 14 days or less. Okay, so to your point there, almost everyone is doing a very short 7 or 14 day induction. But when you overlay the question of understanding, that's where it gets really interesting because almost 83%, 14 days or less of companies, but the real improvement in understanding happens after 30 days. So everyone's missing out, on the good stuff.
All right. If you then get to that point, let's say that you're at the 90 days, if that was the target that was set and it's not a successful fit, what percentage of companies do you see that maybe still hang on to them and then the deviation that's caused by the onboarding debt then gets greater and greater and, 3 years later the person's still there and they're not a good fit versus ones that go very directly 90 days, yep, this didn't work, let's shake hands, let's part our company and we wish you the best of luck into the future?
If I understand the question correctly, the companies that are doing this process are invested and everybody knows, right? People aren't making it past there because the intensity of meeting every week with the manager, okay, so the best practice that's advocated in the book is a 1 hour meeting approximately with the new hire and their manager each week to go through the onboarding sprint plan. And so if they're going to that level, it's absolutely designed for both parties to be super clear that this person is an unsuccessful fit. But that's really quite rare. I would say it's 10%, 15%, 5% in that realm of people because hiring people, often do a good job. And because we come back to the spectrum, what it does is it takes the people who are in the middle of the spectrum and it helps them to understand, it helps them to succeed. Like it does what it does. It does what it says on the sticker, if that makes sense. It helps those people to be successful. But equally, the people who are not interested or it's not their cup of tea, like it also is designed designed intentionally to make them stand out like a sore thumb. So I don't really, because of that, the companies that embed it, I don't really know of many examples where people keep going for a year or more after they've used a 90-day, onboarding process as I've advocated.
Yeah, my question was more about ones that aren't doing that, but then they get to they have a calendar invite in their diary that says, oh, you're supposed to do the probation report on person XYZ now, and they scratch their head and go, oh, it's too hard, and they let it go, and 3 years later the person is still there, and there was a onboarding debt that is now magnified.
Oh, Mick, it's everywhere. Remember that movie where the child actor says to Bruce Willis, I see dead people, they're everywhere? It's like that. You look at the misunderstanding, you grab any person who's got a problem with an employee and you ask that understanding question, right? And you can go to root cause analysis and it comes back to why didn't they understand that during their onboarding? What's their job scorecard, their role scorecard, okay? And it's just everywhere. It's everywhere. Now, I'm conscious of author bias. When you dig deep into a subject, like the whole lens of the world looks like it's that color. But look, that's why I did a research project, because the data bears that out as well. And that was not only my research, I also looked at a lot of other, research along the way to be able to kind of validate that it's happening a lot and it's incredibly expensive.
I'm not at all surprised by your results. So, yeah, there's a chance that you've got confirmation bias, that you're just seeing things because you're researching it. But I can tell you my experience is it's very prevalent. And I'm sure if we had a room full of CEOs right now, one for one, they'd be saying, yep, it's happened and happened. Like it'd almost be a unanimous vote that we do see this happen for sure. Got one more technical question to ask you, and then we'll get to our rapid round that we finish off. You brought up something called the forgetting curve. Tell us what the forgetting curve is and what role that plays in how you might adjust the way you onboard someone.
Herman Ebbinghaus, a chap from the 1800s, psychologist of the day, made a realization that after 7 days, people forget 90% of what they're taught. And so he tested this in his, I'll call it a lab, but I don't know what kind of labs were like back then. He tested it, and it's subsequently been validated multiple times by psychologists through the years that within reason, people forget. And that's why we need a 90-day onboarding, really. There was one person in the interviews that I did, and he said to me, look, mate, what I do is I sit down and I tell them everything they need to know on the first day. And if they forget it, then that's their problem. And so, in other words, we don't bother with all of this onboarding nonsense, was what he was kind of saying, right? And that's fine, okay? But what's the cost of that? And that cost of that comes back to psychology, biology, right? That people simply forget. And so after 7 days, people forget 90% of what they've forgotten. But if you reteach that same thing 7 days later, that comes back up to 100% retention as you teach it. And then another 7 days, so 14 days past origin, it goes back to 90% forgetting, 10% retention, but at a different curve. And then week 3, something special happens. You go back up when you reteach the subject, and then it goes back to 50% retention, okay, in the third time. It doesn't go further than that. And then the fourth time, it goes to 90%. The fourth time that you teach the concept and you review it through maybe a different lens, it goes back to 90% retention. So the first time it's going to 90% loss through to 90% retention after 4 weeks. And that's why, and that's the kind of the framing for the first month, which is understand, getting the person to understand in the first 30 days. And then that's why we switch from teacher to mentor in the second month. And so, yes, we're teaching the same things. We're not saying the same words. We're applying different lenses, but helping them to understand. And so you go back to that forgetting curve whereby we say 83% of people are doing, 14 days or less. And then you overlay that data with the forgetting curve. Like, this is one of the reasons that onboarding is so, terrible across most companies, is that new hires just aren't understanding because they can't. It's in biology.
So what I'm hearing there is onboarding is certainly not set and forget. It requires a certain amount of embedding. And then when you continue to describe it, Brad, I was thinking about experiential learning. So it's not just about teaching the same thing every week. It's about learn, do, reflect. So it might very much start in teacher-student mode, but progressively over time, it turns into doing mode, turns into reflection mode, turns into coaching mode, to make sure that I've got a picture of the curve in my head, by the way. That compounding effect is increasing the retention over that 90-day period, instead of the example you gave of the person that says, I tell them everything on day one and then it's up to them. That's never going to work, right?
It's never going to work, but it's terribly common.
All right. This has been really enlightening, Brad. I really appreciate your time today. I want to go to our rapid round now. And if you haven't caught the show before, Brad, we ask the same 4 questions to all of our guests. So the first one is, what's the one thing you know now that you wish you knew when you were 20?
Consistency. Consistency wins. The greatest force in nature is compounding, and consistency wins. And so, there is no substitute for more time at the plate. There is no substitute for consistently showing up. The companies, the people who win just keep showing up. And the compounding of all of that is how real success occurs, not trying to do 100 things at once.
Brilliant. All right. Thank you, Brad. What's your favorite book?
I would say it'd be easy to go to a Jim Collins, like a good to great. I would say Small Giants by Bo Burlingham. So Bo Burlingham was the editor at Fortune magazine, and he spent his whole career going out and interviewing companies like Apple and Microsoft. And then he began to realize that true greatness is not only born through those companies, but there are other companies who actually don't want to be enormous. And he labeled them small giants. Some of them were 5 million, some of them were 150 million, but they all had these same characteristics in common. And so he couldn't help but he had to write about it because it was just this anomaly that didn't fit with his previous understanding. And so it's, Small Giants.
I like this. I'm going to check it out, and I'll put the link in the show notes on that one as well. And what's your favorite quote?
The signature of mediocrity is chronic inconsistency by Jim Collins.
Yeah, nice one. And that goes along with what you wish you knew when you were 20 as well, with the consistency. Yeah, well done. All right, brilliant. And finally, Brad, how do people get hold of you if they'd like to know more about you, about your books, and about your organisation?
Great, thank you. So book 1 was Made to Thrive that we spoke about. Book 2 is Onboarded, how to bring new hires to the point where they are more effective faster. I've got a weekly newsletter that you can find on my website, which is evolutionpartners.com.au. And I also do a weekly podcast just talking about enduring companies and stuff. That you'll also find either wherever you find good podcasts or on my website. So thank you, Mick. What a pleasure it's been chatting to you today.
Wonderful, Brad. Pleasure was all mine. I've learned a lot today, and I know that the audience would have as well. So thank you so much for your time. Thank you for listening to The Leadership Project at mixbeers.com. A huge call out to Faris Sadek for his video editing of all of our video content, and to all of the team at TLP. Joanne Goes On, Gerald Calabo, and my amazing wife, Say Spears. I could not do this show without you. Don't forget to subscribe to the Leadership Project YouTube channel, where we bring you interesting videos each and every week. And you can follow us on social, particularly on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram. Now, in the meantime, please do take care, look out for each other, and join us on this journey as we learn together and lead together.